welcome back to the next episode of the Existential Files. So, hello, Matthew.
Hello. Each time we introduce it, we find it hard to draw.
Oh my God! I actually was trying. Welcome to the Existential Files,
Absolutely.
Starring Louie, Savva, and Matthew Smith.
And today we are joined by Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Hi.
Is that you putting on that American accent, aren't you, Elizabeth?
No, I'm American.
Are you American?
You're an American, really? Wow.
We could talk about the American Constitution.
We could.
Because you were talking about it. Were we doing on a podcast, or was it in?
That was in a podcast, yes, but yet to be broadcast.
Yet to be broadcast, so we can't. Can not mention that.
So she can't have listened to that yet.
So, Elizabeth, as a reminder to ourselves and to perhaps another listener who may occasionally listen to this. So you have a degree in philosophy? Is that right?
Yes.
And do you, did I say there was a degree in psychology there?
Another bachelor.
So you have two bachelor's degrees, one in philosophy, one in psychology. Two separate degrees. You're not talking about majors and so on. These are two separately studied degrees.
Yes.
So can I ask the question then, first of all, why? Why have you done 2 degrees? And then if we can move on to that. So you've had experience of studying formally psychology and philosophy. What's your take on those 2 approaches? Do you see they go hand in hand? Do they contradict each other? What's your feeling about that?
Personally, I think. Well, I started with a psychology major first, and I started wondering about sort of the fundamental assumptions of psychology. And when I learned that psychology really started in philosophy, that, a lot of the Socratics and the pre-Socratics had done things toward philosophy, and they had asked questions about what is a just society, what is beauty, what is the good. I was like, okay, well, let me go and study. So I started taking classes in philosophy, and then I basically concurrently did both of them at the same time. And I would say that they really do. That philosophy really helped me with psychology, because it helped me ask those deep questions that I think a lot of psychologists just sort of ignore or don't really question about their own discipline. So like one of the, sorry, go ahead.
Such as?
So in the last podcast, I mentioned Popper's falsifiability principle. I just don't think that a lot of psychologists question that principle or ask if there are other principles. And so one of the only psychologists that I saw question that would be Skinner, and then the other psychologist would be Vygotsky. Those are really the 2 psychologists that I noticed that really questioned and thought about what are the sort of principles that we use in our field, and how do these principles affect the way we do science and the way that we gain knowledge. And then you when you start studying philosophy, one of the things that you notice is that your ideas about what knowledge is and what the good is and what things are, like how you define things and what things are, it has so many impacts on how you perceive things and how you study things, and ultimately what you come to believe about the world and perceive about it.
And so tell me about Vygotsky, because he's someone as an undergraduate psychologist I would have touched upon. Again, I want to talk about language development with Vygotsky. I'm looking at Louie. Is he giving me any signs of? It's okay. I'll come back to you, Elizabeth. So, what was Vygotsky's contribution in the context of what you're saying here in terms of how he helped us as a rare psychologist, questioning how we go about? Again, you talked about how we go about trying to develop some element of knowledge, even though, again, the previous podcast we've talked about maybe the fundamental difficulty in trying to gain knowledge, whether it is such a thing as is it possible even. But if as a psychologist he was trying to understand, at least I think it was language development, is that right? Is that one of his big areas? Louie's giving me no signs over here. So
well, he did a lot of revolutionary things for psychology. So he he started coming up with a theory on cultural historical psychology, which he was never able to finish, but a lot of his sort of thinkers and the people that were in the Vygotsky circle have contributed to. And then he also gave us a lot of principles regarding child development, such as the zone of proximal development, and basically using sort of language as a means to teach and model things to children to help them learn.
So this is why I don't know it. I don't remember this stuff because I absolutely hated child developmental psychology, and I used to hate those lectures.
But now Vygotsky is interesting in that sense, and the research on him has resurged a lot. I think it's because he was like a communist, and a lot of, well, at least here in America, a lot of people were sort of against him for that reason. And then his ideas were just so ahead of their time anyway. But I think if we look at his political, he did a lot more than just psychology. He was a philosopher. He was into linguistics. He was into a lot of different fields. And so he wrote extensively about communism and social political philosophy. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
What was the question? But we're now, for me, it was just reminding ourselves and also helping Louie, given that an area now where we are slowly trying to remind ourselves of at least Vygotsky's influence within psychology. So you pointed out that even when within psychology and related fields, he was a very influential theorist. You suggested he's ahead of his time. So particularly in the United States, it's only recently what research in terms of exploring the value of his ideas. So you mentioned him then in the context of one part of his approach was one where he was willing to question and explore some maybe basic tenets of how we might go about doing our work as psychologists.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's why you were feeling for him then. He was someone perhaps who illustrated the value of links between psychology, philosophy, because often psychology is regarded as being something which has emerged out of philosophy, but some of its development in terms of methods. And you're saying, well, Vygotsky as being one person, Skinner another one, you suggested, as someone who wasn't just following along from what's been done before. You're actually trying to suggest more dramatic shifts in how people might go about trying to understand mind, behavior, what it means to be human.
I mean, the thing that comes to my mind is it is one of the problems here that there's a lot of crap research. I mean, if psychologists are defined as, scientists doing psychology, I think we can all agree. And I mean, Matthew was telling me about some research one of his students was doing this morning, and it's basically just a waste of time. And so the fact of the matter is that if we allow students, if we allow academics to do crappy research, do we allow that to define an area? I mean, just because there's a lot of crappy psychologists doesn't mean that there aren't psychologists who, use philosophy of science to inform their work, that do good work and are discovering maybe things out about the research. Is it just because it's a muddied water doesn't mean you can't drink it?
Well, no. I mean, I did research as an undergraduate too, and it wasn't great research or anything, but I wouldn't define it as crappy, Louie, because obviously research is really supposed to help the person and hopefully like the discipline move forward a little bit, right? But so how can that be crappy if it's helping the student learn things?
Well, I'm just saying, the reason I'm calling it crappy is because I think we'll agree that, if the motivation for you to do the research is publish or perish, you're not being motivated to discover the truth.
No, and also, and as Elizabeth points out, actually the kind of research we've been talking about in the context of student work, again, largely it's an opportunity to
teach
for
yourself.
the individual to learn the principles and ideas and the pitfalls of doing research rather than as a contribution to knowledge per se. However, I think your point is, as two people who sort of sat within and looked at psychological work over the years, there is a lot of stuff which isn't great, and doesn't stand up really to the test of time. And that's what we're seeing now within this area that's referred to as psychological science, the challenge of things like replicability, the attempt to try to bring approaches of natural sciences to the study of psychology. And it's kind of slowly falling apart, that many of the phenomena or effects that we may read about as undergraduates really don't necessarily hold true. They're not necessarily things that we can clearly say, this is something we are pretty sure accurately describes this part of experience, this part of behavior.
I mean, because my understanding is, take for example significance testing, and that the p-value is, my understanding is that the p-value is slowly going out of fashion in psychology, you know, and does that mean we just dismiss everything that's come before it and just say, oh, write that off, it was a lot of rubbish? You know, is it a learning experience? You know, psychology is developing and hopefully it's improving.
Well, I think psychologists, not all of them, but a lot of them do things that are not ethical with their statistics in the first place.
But of course, I mean, of course, there's a lot of bad science in science. I mean, and again, I said it earlier, you know, publish or peril, you know, or publish or perish. It is not a motivation for you to produce, you know, good science. If anything, it's a motivation to encourage people to do bad science, because anything is better than nothing.
Absolutely, like you said, the motivation of many academics typically will be one where it's output, publish or perish is, you know, you're showing output, and you're measured or you're identified, your success is by either how many of those outputs or where it's published. It's so-called impact, and that can be shown by publishing in certain types of journals. And a lot of time there's quite clearly a narrative. When you read through journal articles in psychology, you can see within any one set of studies, there's a clear narrative being developed there. There's a point trying to be, and I'm going back now to some of the conversation we had with Nick Brown, where again, within the context of positive psychology, but more broadly in psychology and science and the way the media and journals represent it, it's a human endeavor, isn't it? It's not something which is done in isolation, and therefore, maybe it goes back, Elizabeth, to your questions about, or your thoughts about how we go about building knowledge. But it's always limited, it's always going to be tainted, it's always going to be only so much we can set and infer from it. And maybe that's not what I would say. It's just that there's always some sort of principle that we're using to sort of guide our inquiry or determine if something is true, or to perceive the world. Like all of our perceptions are based on our sort of beliefs and our values and our value judgments, that this seems like a real perception, right? And so as an epistemological nihilist, I would say, well, why are we using any of those principles in the first place? And there is no justification for those principles that we've chosen. We've just chosen them. They sound good, but you can't really justify why I should use this principle over some other principle. And so the knowledge, anything that comes from that principle of inquiry, right? Any sort of knowledge that comes from that, or claims that come from that, you can't, because you have made these assumptions at the very beginning, the foundation is filled with assumptions, then I just don't see how I should accept this as true and as a knowledge claim. Fair enough.
I mean, I'm still not convinced personally.
But still, okay, so going back to philosophy then, so again, your experience, Elizabeth, in terms of studying psychology and philosophy and understanding, to some extent, the different approaches to, maybe knowledge claims. Do you feel philosophy as an approach is better placed, is less problematic, is less assumption prone, and whatever terms you want to use here?
I think philosophy is problematic too, because philosophy makes assumptions as well. I mean, if you look at their sort of, there's a reliance on logic, and logic has, I mean, I like logic, don't get me wrong, like formal logic is amazing, but there's a lot of assumptions that are made regarding logic and regarding mathematics that I don't think that you can say that even these are truth claims. I think that a lot of philosophers don't want to even go to that point. You know, if you look at it, a lot of philosophers are not going to be like a modal realist, right? They're not going to take like a really extreme position. And so I think that a lot of philosophers they stop at a certain point. They'll look at the inquiry, they'll ask the questions, but after a certain point, they'll be like, you know, I don't want to go all the way to its extreme conclusion.
Can I change the subject because I'm aware of timing and stuff. I mean, Elizabeth, I seem to remember that you had some questions about positive psychology, and that's one of the topics that I think we've explored a few times on this podcast. Given Matt's experience in positive psychology, given my seeming skepticism of positive psychology, have you got any questions or anything about positive psychology? If I remember correctly, you have a slight interest in positive psychology. Is that right?
Yes, I did. I did some research a couple years ago that used Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness, and then some of his work regarding positive psychology.
Go on, tell us a bit about that, or do you thoughts about that? Do you feel that positive psychology is an approach within psychology which has value?
I think that it has some value. There is this the thing that I find interesting about this particular type of psychology, at least my understanding of it, I don't know if this is correct or not, but it seems like they're trying to define happiness they do a lot of happiness research, but they try to define happiness in a sort of a behavioral way. So they define it completely based on behavior. And I think, like, while that helps us study it in a scientific sense, I don't think it gives us a full understanding of it. I don't think we'll ever be able to have a full understanding of it, just because happiness is more than just the sort of behavioral expression of it. There's like a mental facet and emotional facet. That
So I'd want a question saying, I'm not sure if they do, whoever they are, but I'm not sure that there is an emphasis on behavioral measures of happiness. I mean, I go to the work of people like Ed Diener, who coined the term subjective well-being as an attempt to do so-called scientific academic psychology work on the idea of happiness. And subjective well-being, therefore, he would measure through, as often psychological work is, rightly or wrongly, through kind of self-report measures, but conceptually linking affective experience, so essentially emotional experience, so whether or not people are experiencing broadly positive, negative affect, so there's something about that subjective experience there, combined with an overall sense of how satisfied you are with your life. He took that to me kind of indicate subjective well-being, and therefore a lot of the work on happiness in psychology has typically been work on subjective well-being. And then you go to the work of people like Carol Riff, who in a paper, I want to say maybe in the late 1980s, so kind of pre-positive psychology as a discipline being sort of identified. I think the paper was something like happiness is everything, or is it? And started exploring what she ended up referring to as psychological well-being, and again exploring other dimensions that would link to people's overall well-being, and they wouldn't necessarily be purely behavioural in terms of their measurement. So that's why I'm questioning the idea, saying, well, given that positive psychologists are largely using behavioural measures, I'm not sure they are.
Well, I meant behavioral expression in the sense of doing like a self-report measure and circling a number or checking a box or whatever, because I have problems with that. Like if we look at like a Likert scale, the distance between each number is variable to each person, because I could think 2 and 3 are very close and someone else could think they're very far apart, and the distance between each choice on a Likert scale is just not, that's why, like, to me, like, the even, and then like we all know like the problems with self-report measures. I mean, you guys know those, right?
Well, yeah, and absolutely. And then maybe, assume we have any other listeners, that we may well find that others are not so clear on that. But absolutely, so I'm saying, and you're saying that, well, by behavioural measures, we can include self-report measures where people fill in, psychological scales. They do give ratings on either agreement scales or something else, how much it describes me. And absolutely, I'm with you in terms of how much that really gives us an understanding of people's experience of, even if this notion of happiness, broader notions of well-being, does it really capture something when we say, well, this person is an 8 on a 1 to 10 scale in terms of their happiness or well-being, or whatever term we want to use. And absolutely, that's something that still happens. That's still a way in which it is used within psychological research. It is when we look at how it's then applied politically, and contemporary sort of discourse includes attempts to measure kind of nations' well-being, and often it's through these very brief attempts to give a number to something. So I completely agree there that you're missing, to try to reduce these things to numbers could be again on a high to nothing. Then if that's what psychologists is about, is trying to quantify these things, that's where I have now more time for qualitative approaches, which as an undergraduate I didn't even cover. 20 years ago we didn't cover qualitative methods on an undergraduate psychology degree, at least when I did, and increasingly now we do look at a range of methods and maybe looking at how they can be used in different ways and in combinations to better understand the range of psychological experience. So I think there is still when you go down the qualitative way, you're looking at people, and often the method there is interviewing, and you're asking people to talk about their experience and understand their lived experience. So again,
and I mean, how many of us really understand our experience?
It's funny enough, I was going to interject and say, I mean, surely the person themselves are the only person who can say whether they're happy or not. I mean, what the fuck else are you going to be doing? I mean, sticking him in a brain scanning machine and say, this person has a high level of happiness in the brain. I mean, I'm not buying any of it. So I don't really see, recognizing that it's a difficult task. And I mean, anyone listening to the one person, you listening to this podcast, knows that I'm extremely skeptical of positive psychology. I still don't know how else you would, surely the person knows whether they're happy.
Actually, that was my question for you, Louie, because how can you be so skeptical of positive psychology and not skeptical of other types of psychology when they all seem to use the same sort of methods and statistics and sort of research?
Sure.
I mean, I think for me, and I've often compared positive psychology to kind of Dianetics, Scientology,
oh, please don't do that, because at least positive psychology is actually based in like a foundation of not a foundation, but it's at least based in some type of like objective knowledge claims, or at least trying to find the truth. Whereas Dianetics was just made up by some like L. Ron Hubbard at like random.
Ron Hubbard had connections to those aliens. They told him exactly what was happening. And if you're telling me that's wrong, I want my £1 million back from Scientology, please. No, but I mean,
and whereas in the past I've got quite angry with Louie to link those together, the thing I'm now picking up on is that the potential danger of positive psychology is indeed its claim to an objective evidence base. If it turns out the so-called objective or whatever evidence base is fundamentally flawed, and if we're saying we're trying to do it on self-report measures, they have their limitations, and that applies to other areas of psychology. So I would say I'm as skeptical about positive psychology myself as other areas of psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I think the reason that the area of debate I think Louie and I have had in the past, to some extent, is the reason why I'm drawn to it as an area of psychology that may have something to tell me as an individual that may be helpful to me, is in a similar way to what philosophy might do, but it's a different way into it. Given that I've been training in psychology and understand those kind of methods and the discourse there, is that we're tapping into those same kinds of questions in terms of what does it mean to live a life well lived.
And this is where my problems come, is that, for example, so then the question was asked, why am I not skeptical of other areas of psychology? Well, I mean, the Stroop effect, it's pretty boring. Red is quicker than red-blue, right? And the fact of the matter is that the evidence is overwhelming, and it suggests that that's something that's going on inside the brain, some kind of encoding, some kind of processing. Well, I don't really see what there's to be skeptical about. On the other hand, who defines what a life worth living is? Who defines what happiness is? Who defines, and I don't agree that, one person's life worth living is another person's hell on earth. And I just think, I feel it just smacks a little bit to my when I've encountered positive psychology, and I'm the first person to say that I'm extremely I don't know enough about it. I don't know about positive psychology very much at all. I know much more about cognitive psychology, social psychology. That, again, it feels to me like they've defined what a life worth living is, and that's what they're trying to help other people get. And I mean, fuck you. I don't want your stinking help. Leave me to my life that you've defined as not worth living.
And I don't think that the so-called they have done that, but I think your critique of it is more on that philosophical basis to it, as opposed to the methods used. It's like,
Yes.
well, I'm not even too bothered about the methods used, because I'm suspicious of what the agenda may be.
And I read Seligman's, the APA address, and the little girl saying, "Oh, Dad, why are you so grumpy?" I mean, if that was my grandchild, I'd go tell her to fuck herself and come back to me when she's fucking 90 years old and tell me how fucking happy she is. Because I'm fucking telling you, some 5-year-old saying, "Oh, Daddy, don't be so grumpy," can go fuck herself. But that's just my, psychological opinion.
And on that bombshell, does that answer your question, Elizabeth? Next caller. No. So again, just checking our time. I think we probably are in terms of. So what are your thoughts there? So have we? In some ways, I think it's useful to remind both Louie and I in terms of our relative positions. And I think even me, given that when we've introduced it on this podcast, me trying to at least explain my understanding and my approach within positive psychology, and we've had a few guests again that have sort of supplemented that, is that I'm skeptical about psychology, yet there's still something about an attempt within psychology, and it's maybe the applied nature of it, that in the teaching, in the work that I do, which is more in terms of, again, supporting master students and so on, are there ideas here that we can apply in our own lives and in working contexts that may be helpful in terms of how we perform at our best, whatever that may be. And in some ways it does, much of the time, bypass some of the very fundamental questions that Louie would have. It's saying, well, a life well lived, or even is life worth living? That's the kind of debate we've often had. It's very fundamental, and we're not really coming down to the mechanics of Likert scales and statistics and so on. That in many ways is several steps down the line, and we're still debating the whole fundamental premise of it.
And sometimes, and in some ways, it's a personal. I mean, we started chatting with Elizabeth in the previous podcast about, do you believe in good? Do you believe in bad? Again, I think that these answers are almost personal to yourself, and whether you choose to value that or whatever, then that's up to you in some ways, and you can't ask any objective, standard to inform that. But should we say? Thank you for our listener for joining us.
Thank you.
Hopefully sometime in the near future, if the podcast continues and if you still continue to listen, because maybe you'll give up. I mean,
and if you have more questions that we can help you with,
please come back to the Oracle at Delphi and ask us for your fortune.
And until then, let's say bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.